Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and we have with us today Dr. Howard Campbell. He's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at El Paso, and he's going to tell us all about his experiences in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico and about a book that he has out, Mexican Memoir. Dr. Campbell, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, George. I'm really glad to be here.
Good. Maybe we can start out by talking a little bit about your background, where you've studied, what areas you concentrated in.
Sure. Let me just start by saying I grew up along the U.S.-Canadian border. I think we're obsessed with the Mexican border here, but I grew up near Canada, actually. But did my PhD at the University of Wisconsin and finished in 1990. And since then, I've been at UTEP, so I've been here about 11 years.
And what areas or what subject within anthropology did you concentrate on?
I'm a cultural anthropologist. My main specialty is Mexico, especially indigenous cultures of Mexico, and my long-term focus has been on the Zapotec Indians of Oaxaca and southern Mexico.
How would you get interested in that coming from Wisconsin?
Yeah, it's a long story for sure. I guess maybe it was because I was living in this cold climate in Wisconsin, and when I was in Mexico, I just loved the weather and the people and the warmth of everything.
What took you there originally?
Well, it's sort of a long story. I grew up in a fairly isolated area in Idaho, and when I graduated from college, like most young people, I wanted to see the world, and I traveled to Europe, and I really liked that, but when I went down to Mexico, I found that this was really what I liked. It's what I liked the best. It was more exciting for me than Europe. I just wanted to stay, and so I ended up teaching English in Mexico City, and ended up getting married to a woman who turns out was from Oaxaca, who was a Zapotec Indian, and she took me down to see her family, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon I was studying her people.
So we're down in the southern part of Mexico. Where exactly is the area that you studied?
The area I studied is in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in southern Mexico, right along the Pacific Ocean. It's one of the southernmost states of Mexico, right next to Chiapas. So it's pretty far south, about 200 miles.
Where Mexico gets a bit narrow there and curves?
That's right, about 200 miles south of Mexico City.
And what kind of a state is Oaxaca?
Oaxaca is a very beautiful state, very mountainous and with wonderful beaches along the Pacific Ocean. It has the highest concentration of indigenous people in Mexico. There's 16 different Indian groups there, the Zapotecs being the largest group.
And where exactly would Juchitán be?
Juchitán is the largest city in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. That's where I did most of my research. It's a city of about 100,000 people, but what's interesting about it is it's run by Indians from top to bottom. So this is a city run by Indians in Mexico, which I think is a very important thing.
What kind of Indians would we find in
These are Zapotecs, Isthmus Zapotecs, and my ex-wife was from that group. So
Zapotec is a large group?
Yeah, there are roughly 500,000 Zapotec Indians in Oaxaca, and some of them are actually in California and in Mexico City and different parts of Mexico, but overall there's 500,000 Zapotecs, so it's a very large group. But the group I studied is in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It's just one of the many different Zapotec groups.
And Zapotec's an old civilization?
Yeah, this is one of the ancient civilizations of Mexico. Oftentimes I say it's one of the three great civilizations of ancient Mexico, being the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Zapotecs.
You met your wife and you go down into this community. Tell us the story. What happens?
Well, it's a very long, complex story, but
sure.
I had been an English teacher in Mexico City, and I was studying Spanish at the National University at the UNAM, and I met this woman who was very interesting to me in many, many ways, and when she took me to see her family in Oaxaca, I realized this was a whole different culture, the Zapotec culture that was distinct from the Mexican national culture with its ancient traditions, with modern traditions, with their own language, a rich cuisine, and an important political movement that I ended up studying called COSE, which is the party that's run Juchitán for many years.
And how do people live in that area? When you first went and visited her family and visited some of the relatives, what kinds of things did you see?
I was just struck by how happy and warm the social environment was. It seemed like it was a very festive atmosphere, that there was fiestas every week, and people spent an awful lot of time just sitting around joking and laughing and talking and having fun. And it really, for me, coming from Wisconsin, which is both cold physically, geographically, but also the social atmosphere is a little more conservative and reserved.
Sure.
Being down in this environment where people spent much of their time being with other people and socializing and laughing, and very boisterous, affectionate, loud people, there was something about it that was very attractive to me.
And this, I would imagine, was quite a contrast with Mexico City also.
Yeah, Mexico
That's where
City.
you spent much of your time?
Right. Oaxaca is one of the poorest states in Mexico. It's predominantly a peasant state, and so a lot of people are rural farmers, but they have a lot of time on their hands. Once the farmers have planted their corn, they spend a lot of time hanging around in the cantinas and just having fun, going to the fiestas. There's a lot of time to develop different things that we don't have time for. Socializing, laughing, humor, the art of conversation. I just felt like this was a social environment that was very rich and interesting, and so I wanted to study it.
And do you marry into the family first, or do you start doing your research first, or are they all happening at the same time?
Yes, first I was married down there, and this was quite an interesting event because supposedly the Zapotecs have a matriarchal society, that is a female-dominated society. So I was marrying a matriarch, okay? So here I was, this tall, white gringo, marrying a short Zapotec Indian who had the fame of being a matriarch. And so I felt like it had a certain literary dimension to it, which really excited me, but also I wanted to study the culture from an anthropological standpoint.
Sure.
But anyway, so we get married there, and then I decided to come back with research money and do an extended study of the Zapotecs, but focusing especially on the radical political movement called COSE.
Sure.
But also I was interested in this issue of matriarchy, because according to Mexican national folklore, the Tehuanas, the women of Tehuantepec, are the dominant ones in the Zapotec households. And so I was interested to explore that dynamic a bit.
Sure.
Not only through my research, but in the marriage as well.
Let's talk about the marriage itself. What was your reception when you went to Juchitán? How did the marriage become arranged? And
Well, I think in many ways I had the ideal setup for doing research because I was married into a local family. People
Right.
then accepted me as a brother-in-law, son-in-law. You know, I was related to a family. I was part of a family network. And so I had, I think, more acceptance than the average outsider would. That really helped in the research. And so I was able to see things from the inside, in the families, in the fiestas, and even going to political demonstrations and feeling a certain acceptance when I was there.
And did you explain to them that you were researching this? Were you consciously gathering information from them? Were they aware of this all the time?
It was tricky because I went down there in the early 80s, and at that time the PRI was absolutely in control of the country. The PRI ran Mexico for 71 years, and I was studying COSE, which was a left-wing opposition movement. And so I had to overcome a number of hurdles. First of all, the COSE, I had to get them to accept me. I had to show that I wasn't some kind of a CIA agent or someone sent by the Mexican government or something.
Sure.
I had to gain their confidence. But at the same time, I was worried about being viewed as, from the government standpoint, from the PRI standpoint, as being some kind of subversive. And so it was important for me to indicate, first of all, I was there initially because I was married into a local family, but secondly, that I was doing academic research. Even though it was on a controversial topic, politics, I was there for serious academic scholarly reasons. And eventually that worked out, but it took a long time. It took about 6 months of going to fiestas and drinking beer in cantinas with leaders of this political movement, and making sure they saw me all the time with my wife's family so they understood that I did have this local connection.
Right. What's the origins of the COSE movement? What's the origins of the party? This is an opposition party.
That's right.
Mexico has a number of what used to be small opposition parties. Some of them have gotten quite large recently, but what's the origins of COSE?
The origins of COSE go back to the Mexican student movement of the 1960s, but actually its roots are much, much deeper because the Zapotecs have a tradition of autonomy and independence. They fought against the Aztecs, they fought against the Spanish, they fought against the French when they were in control of Mexico in the 19th century. So COSE tried to pick up that tradition of rebellion and independence and channel it against the PRI. And so you had these veterans of the '68 student movement coming back to Juchitán, organizing the people and saying, now it's time for the Zapotecs to control their own land and their own towns and teach their culture in the schools. So this was a very vigorous ethnic political movement with also a cultural dimension, promoting the language, promoting arts and crafts and the customs of the local people. So for me as an anthropologist, there was lots there to dig my teeth into. And
Sure.
I felt very supportive of this movement because for a long time, the PRI absolutely had this domination of the entire political system, and I felt here was an opposition movement with broad popular support that had very important cultural aims as well, and so I felt a lot of allegiance with this movement. I felt like I could support the movement in good faith.
Sure. What exactly did they do? Run candidates? What were their activities?
Well, initially they were excluded from running for office, so they had to engage in a lot of demonstrations and protests. They blocked the Pan American Highway that runs by Juchitán. They took over buildings. Eventually, the Mexican military committed a number of massacres against Kosei, and what that did was created martyrs, and the movement got even stronger. But they held many protests, hunger strikes in Mexico City, building takeovers, etc. Eventually, they had the support of most of the people of Juchitán, and in 1981, they won the elections there. And that was the first time a left-wing party had won a local election, a municipal election of any significance since the revolution. So it was a major event. I mean, this was something comparable to the Zapatista rebellion in Chiapas, but the difference being that this was a nonviolent movement. It was a democratic movement that won through elections as opposed to taking up arms. So for many reasons, I felt this was a very important story to tell, and then having the personal connection through my wife, I think, enriched the whole experience all the more.
What happens when they come into power?
Well, they were in power in 81, from 81 to 83, and they had what they called the People's Government, El Ayuntamiento Popular. And for 2 years, they tried to transform the city of Juchitán, but with tremendous opposition from the state government, national government. So eventually they were thrown out after an incident of violence. In 83, they were kicked out of office. Literally, the Mexican military took over Juchitán City Hall. But eventually, Kosei regrouped, and in 86, they got back into the electoral sphere, and they were in a coalition government with the PRI. And then from 88 onward, they've won the elections in Juchitán. Up until this year, actually, they lost once again to the PRI. But for 12 years, Kosei controlled this town, and it was really a unique place in southern Mexico where you had a radical Indian movement in charge of their own town.
What did they try to do differently?
Well, a number of things. The main thing was to say, look, this is local people in charge of our community, Indian people. So they had the judges speaking the Zapotec language, the police, the teachers, promoting the culture, okay? But also working on problems of, say, the peasants who had lost land, trying to get their land back, trying to get higher wages for working class people. I mean, this was basically a socialistically oriented movement. It was very much for the people and not for the wealthier classes. So it was very challenging to the government and to the system. But the wise thing that the PRI and the national government did was they decided, let's just let these people run things, because they have the majority, they have the support. And so Kosei really was left unmolested for about 12 years, and they ran the town of Juchitán.
The Zapotec language you mentioned, is this something that's in common use in the area still?
Yeah, most people there speak the Zapotec language and Spanish. They're bilingual, but usually their first language is Zapotec, and they'll often say that jokes are funnier in the Zapotec language, that life is richer when they speak their own language, but they also have a kind of blend of Zapotec and Spanish that we sometimes call Zapochueco, that is sort of chueco meaning twisted or broken or wrong somehow, but it's a kind of slang, something like Spanglish.
Sure.
But this is a very lively language, very, I don't know how to describe it, but some people have said it was like the Italian of the Americas. It has a certain
very
flair. Very expressive, and the people themselves are intense and boisterous and constantly joking. And they also like to joke sort of in this mixture, this hybrid of Zapotec and Spanish.
What's everyday life like in Juchitán? You mentioned the women are perceived to have a particular role in the society. What do the men do? What do the women do? What happens on an average day?
Sure, the traditional division of labor is women running the markets and men working in the fields. And so the men get up very early. Everyone sleeps in hammocks there because it's so hot all year round. So you get out of your hammock at about 5 in the morning, the man goes off to work in the fields, and then at about 7 or 8 the woman goes to the market. And the marketplaces are run absolutely by women. Men are not even supposed to go in there.
Okay? Oh, really?
So it creates an interesting dynamic. There's also another social element, which is a group called muje, which are transvestite males who often are bakers or jewelers, and they can also sell in the marketplace, but they're not farmers. They're very effeminate men who dress in a very specific feminine way, and they have a distinct social role in the Zapotec culture. So on a daily basis, you'd see the women in the marketplace, you'd see a few muje around in the markets as well, dressed in a very extravagant costume oftentimes. So everyday life there is very colorful. The fiestas go on almost every week. There's some sort of fiesta, and at the fiestas the women wear very elaborately embroidered huipiles, blouses, and long flowing skirts, and the complement to that dress is gold jewelry that they wear around their neck, oftentimes worth $2,000 or $3,000. So you have very elegantly dressed women, especially at the fiestas, the men dressed in sort of typical peasant costumes, and so it appears that the women are the dominant ones, because they run the markets, they have the money. What I found in my research, in fact, was that really it wasn't true that women controlled the society, that men had a lot of the privileges. Like, They didn't have to work as hard. They spent a lot of time in cantinas having a lot of fun, and oftentimes having second and third women on the side. And so it really appeared that women in some ways had the short end of the stick, even though at the fiestas and in the markets they appeared to stand out and look so impressive.
Do they have control of the money at all?
Well, actually, in the traditional setup, they do
sense.
have control of the money. That the woman controls the money from what she sells in the market, and if a man sells his corn, he gives the money to his wife, and then she gives him back a little allowance. I don't know if I should go into this, but that little allowance has a Zapotec name, which is Xquieni, which means his penis. Okay, so she's actually giving back to him a little allowance called his penis that then he can spend to sort of rebolster his masculinity, but the notion being that the woman's in control of the money. Okay, that's the traditional setup, but a lot of that is changing. Okay, and what I found that even in the traditional arrangement, it was really the men that had more free time, they had less responsibilities in the household. Women did a lot more work, and men had a lot more sexual freedoms. The one thing that was distinct, though, is that women had this very impressive role in the fiestas with beautiful, exotic clothing, and running the market, I think, gave them a sense of power that many women perhaps don't have in American society. And also there was a kind of solidarity among women wearing the same clothing, a sort of ethnic costume that made them stand out. And women there are taught to have a lot of pride and self-confidence. So on the one hand, yes, I saw that it seemed that men really had more of the power. In fact, men were the politicians and often the bankers. The larger businesses were run by men. But women did have this core of solidarity with other women and a very important role in the culture as people that are sort of the stars of the fiestas and the ones that run the market. So it is a complex, ambiguous situation, and I think it's one that's attracted a lot of people to this area to see these women.
What are the fiestas? What do they represent? Are there more fiestas in that area than other parts of Mexico? Is it more interwoven in daily life?
It seems like there are more fiestas there and more elaborate and extravagant ones. And many of these fiestas are planned for a year or two in advance. People are getting together the money, the costumes, the decorations, the food. Everything takes extensive planning. And when the fiesta happens, you have 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. Women decked out in just incredibly brilliantly colored clothing, exotic, bright clothing, dancing all night in these fiestas with great food and lots of beer and mezcal and tequila and people having all kinds of riotous fun and getting so drunk they pass out and the fiesta keeps going. I mean, really wild all-night parties. Then they get up and do it again. And, you know, this happens week after week, month after month.
What's the occasion for a fiesta? Are they connected to religious holidays or are they personal events?
Yeah, the big fiestas, of course, are for the patron saints of each community or for other saints' days, that sort of thing. But also there are elaborate wedding celebrations and birthday parties and various miscellaneous fiestas. So it seems like a very festive kind of area. I mean, there's always some party going on, and the Zapotecs seem to love that. It's like a culture of celebration, a kind of hedonistic culture where people really love to eat and drink and dance, and they don't seem to have any restrictions about that. They really go whole hog into it, and I really enjoy that naturally.
What do they eat there? What kind of food?
The food is great.
It's
right along the Pacific Ocean, so they have some of the best seafood in all of Mexico. Great giant shrimp, lobster, red snapper, all kinds of different fish and so on. I mean, the cuisine is excellent. People know how to cook. They spend a lot of time cooking. There's a lot of tropical fruits there. They also have cattle and chicken, pigs, etc. So they have a rich cuisine, lots of herbs and traditional recipes. So to me, eating was one of the great joys of my research, and it was so inexpensive in the markets. Every day you could get fresh shrimp and seafood that had never even been put on ice, and it was, you know, a couple dollars a pound, $1 a pound, very cheap. So I must say living was pretty good there.
Sure. Now, the family that you were with, your wife's family, what did they do on a regular basis? How did you fit into the household when you were there?
It was a very interesting household. The father was a former peasant farmer who was retired and now was a jewelry maker. So every day he would be pounding away making jewelry with very primitive tools, but he would be there in the household doing that. My brother-in-law lived right next door. He was a mechanic. He would fix the cars right in front of the house in the street with primitive equipment. His hoist was a rock and a board to lift up cars, and he had just, you know, a few screwdrivers and a hammer and pliers, and there he would be working on the cars. My sister-in-law had a little store in the house, and so there was this sort of endless social environment of people coming and going, people working in the household. So it was a very intense, lively household. We were always in touch with neighbors and clients and relatives, and I felt like I was always part of a social scene, something that sometimes in the United States a person can be very isolated, very alone, but there it was impossible. There were always people around and always conversations going on and kids coming in and out of the house, and there was something I really loved about that, the intensity of social ties and family ties. So that the household was an endless sort of source of people coming and going, and for me as an anthropologist, I constantly had my notebook out and I was scratching down ideas. So.
What kind of surprises did you find? What did you find particularly interesting about everyday life there?
Tricky. There were so many different experiences which I wrote about in the book. One of the problems was they have pistoleros, which are hired gunmen. I mean, there were people, literally their job was to kill people, okay? And since my brother-in-law was a mechanic, sometimes you'd have the pistoleros show up with their cars to be repaired. And I remember one time when this pistolero guy came and he took off his shirt and he had these scars all over his stomach from gunshot wounds and so on. I mean, there was a degree of violence there. When there were social conflicts, you could literally pay these pistoleros to go kill your enemies for $400, $500, $300, something like that. And these people were part of the town. People knew who they were. And so I guess that was sort of shocking to see that form of justice, if you want to call it, being so openly displayed. Eventually,
kind of an element of danger.
Yeah, there was kind of a Wild West,
family feuds, or that type of.
Yeah, definitely. There was sort of a Wild West atmosphere because you had cantinas on every corner, and sometimes fights would spill out of the cantinas, and we would just sit there in front of the house staring, watching the fight. But also very beautiful traditions and customs would be there right out in the open. I mean, funeral processions would go by our house, fiesta processions. There was always people coming and going, and so I felt like this was the easiest way to do anthropology, just sort of sitting in the household, observing, taking part, and trying to soak up as much information as I could, both good and bad.
Sure. On a typical day there, what kind of a cycle do people have? Do they get up early and work in the fields?
Yeah, the peasants get up like 5 or 6, 4 o'clock in the morning, very early, because they want to beat the heat. It's tropical weather all year round, and so they'd go to work with their old wooden ox carts, and so you'd hear the ox cart wheels kind of thumping along, and they'd wake me up. I'd be in my hammock, and I'd pop out of bed. They would take off to the fields, women would go to the market, and then out in the streets, kids would be playing, you know, running around, and there was just kind of a very easy atmosphere there. I mean, there weren't that many cars going by, and kids out playing, very restive, relaxing, and people lying in their hammocks.
Is there a siesta cycle there still?
Yeah, in the afternoons, people often would take a siesta at about 1 or 2 o'clock, and hammocks are perfect for that. You just swing the hammock, and it cools you off and naturally causes you to fall asleep. So I felt like in some ways this was like the stereotypical tropical sleepy village, and there's a lot to be said for that way of living.
That sounds like a fascinating experience to go and do that research, and hopefully some of our viewers will take a look at the book and read more of the details there. You return to the United States and you end up at UTEP. What kinds of things do you teach at UTEP? What kind of work do you do there?
Sure, I teach cultural anthropology classes. I teach a class called Contemporary Mexican Culture because my specialty is indigenous peoples of Mexico, but I'm also extremely interested in Mexican national culture, about politics and economics and that sort of thing. I teach various classes about Latin America and basic anthropology classes.
Do you have graduate students doing work?
Unfortunately, not in anthropology. We have a master's in sociology, and so sometimes we have anthropologically inclined students go into that, but the anthropology program itself is just an undergraduate program. What
kinds of things do you cover in your courses? What types of things would students experience?
Well, I guess the main point is we're trying to indicate the broad diversity of culture. That the United States has a certain way of living, which is very fine, but there are many other ways of doing things that are quite different, such as in Mexico, the diverse peoples of Mexico. And we just want to expose students to all these different ways of thinking, living, behaving, so that they'll have those things as a repertoire and have greater understanding of the different cultures of the world.
How do the students at UTEP react to your description of life in Juchitán?
I think they really enjoy it because it appeals to their sense of the richness of Mexican culture. And I've found that teaching at UTEP is a wonderful experience because so many of my students speak Spanish and know about Mexican customs, and therefore I really can enter into a rich dialogue. And in fact, I learn a lot from the students about Mexican culture.
Have you met people in the El Paso area or from Ciudad Juarez that are part of other indigenous cultures? Have you worked with other?
Yeah, I've done a little bit of research in Juarez. There's a group called the Tarahumaras, of course. They have a community, and I know this woman at UTEP who's done an extensive study of them in Ciudad Juarez, and I've worked with her. But also there are Mixtec Indians that come across the border from Mexico into El Paso. You sometimes see them at Walgreens and various stores. They're from Oaxaca as well. So there are some indigenous peoples here locally, as well as, of course, the Tiguas. And I do research for a tribe in Las Cruces known as the Puro Manso Tiwa.
And their origins are?
Similar to the Tiguas.
Okay,
yeah.
Coming from the Pueblo.
That's right.
Groups.
But also they include the Mansos, who are the indigenous peoples of this area.
And what are you currently working on? Do we have articles underway, or?
Well, I'm working on two book projects. One is a novel called Juarez, and it's about the life of this area, and the other one is concerned with the beatnik writers of the 50s and their lives in Mexico.
Fascinating. The book is Mexican Memoir, and it can be found in bookstores in the El Paso area, and we encourage our readers to take a look at that and learn more about this experience. Howard, we certainly want to thank you for coming in today and sharing some of your experiences with us, and hopefully some folks will be interested in taking some of your courses at UTEP as well. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you very much.
And we want to thank all of you as well for joining us today on Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and we hope to see you on our next program.